Welcome back to The Explainer. You know, if you've ever watched a classic heist movie, you're probably familiar with that incredibly satisfying montage, right? The mastermind travels around assembling a team of absolute specialists. You've got the safecracker, the getaway driver, the inside man. Well, back in the early 17th century, a remarkably similar assembly took place. But, actually, scratch that. This wasn't for a bank job. This was an elite squad of minds brought together for literally one of the most ambitious literary and theological projects in human history, the translation of the King James Bible. And today, we are going to look really closely at one specific, absolutely fascinating team from that massive project.
So we really have to ask ourselves, who actually translated the most poetic, the most structurally complex books of the Bible? Like, who were the real people sitting in those dusty rooms day after day, wrestling with these ancient, heavy linguistic puzzles? To answer that, we're looking at the group responsible for the sweeping, intensely poetic section known as the Prophets. Section 1. The Mission and the Anchor.
Okay, let's dive into this. While other companies tackled the earlier texts, this group, the First Oxford Company, which, fun fact, was actually the third group formed, was handed a seriously daunting mission, translating the books from Isaiah straight through to Malachi. To pull this off, they needed an anchor to keep this massive undertaking completely grounded. Enter John Harding. Harding was the Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford and the president of Magdalen College. If we're talking about our translation heist team, Harding is absolutely your administrative and academic rock. He was renowned for his unshakable constancy. He deeply, truly believed that the university's ultimate mission was preserving sacred truth, and he viewed the ancient prophets' warnings as totally vital for the spiritual health of England at that time.
But, Harding wasn't just a manager. He had a very specific linguistic superpower. Because he was a master of classical Hebrew, he intimately understood something called the prophetic tense. Now, this is a really unique linguistic quirk, where Hebrew prophets speak of future events as if they are actively happening right then in the present. Harding's keen ear for this meant he ensured the English translation captured that exact, absolute certainty of the original prophets.
Section 2. The Visionary John Reynolds.
Every grand endeavor needs a visionary, right? Someone who sees the big picture way before anyone else does. And for the King James Bible, that man was John Reynolds. He was the president of Corpus Christi College, and actually the person who originally pitched the whole idea of a new English translation directly to King James. To really understand the scale of Reynolds' intellect, you just have to look at how his contemporaries described him. They literally called him a living library and a third university. I mean, just think about that for a second. The man's brain was considered the equivalent of an entire academic institution. He was a moderate Puritan of immense piety, and his vast reading gave the First Oxford Company an incredible depth of historical and theological knowledge.
And his devotion? It wasn't just theoretical. This is where the story gets incredibly moving. During the translation process, Reynolds contracted consumption, what we call tuberculosis today. But rather than step down and rest, he kept going. He continued to hold the translation committee meetings right there in his sick room. He literally worked through the final stages of a terminal illness because he viewed this translation as his ultimate and final service to God.
What Reynolds was doing in those final days wasn't just, surface-level reading. He was an absolute master of philology. He would meticulously analyze the Hebrew and Greek, trace ancient word roots through multiple layers of historical usage, and ensure absolute technical perfection. The prophets use incredibly heavy layered theological language, and Reynolds was the guy making sure the roots of those exact words were honored perfectly.
Section 3. The Poet and the Grammarian. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the fascinating dynamic it shows within the team. You've got these two brilliant heavyweights who approach the text from totally complementary angles. On one side, we have Thomas Holland, whose focus is entirely on Hebraic poetics, the rhythm, the alliteration, the real soul of the text. And then on the other side, we have Richard Kilby, whose focus is entirely on the granular mechanics, lexicography, grammar, breaking down incredibly rare roots. They're essentially the yin and yang of ancient translation.
Let's look at Holland first. Thomas Holland was the rector of Exeter College and a Regius Professor of Divinity. Known across Europe as a mighty biblicist, his specific role was absolutely vital for books like Isaiah. Isaiah is high-level, sweeping poetry. So Holland's specific skill was capturing that rhythmic soul in English without ever sacrificing the literal meaning of the original Hebrew roots.
Holland was also known for his intense religious fervor. Just to give you a taste of his personality, whenever he left his college for a journey, he wouldn't just say a simple goodbye to his students. No way. He would boldly declare, "I commend you to the love of God and to the hatred of popery and superstition." He was fiery, he was passionate, and deeply, deeply invested in the spiritual stakes of their work.
Contrast that fiery energy with Richard Kilby. Kilby was the rector of Lincoln College and the author of a highly respected Hebrew grammar book. His specific edge was analyzing what they called hard words. See, the minor prophets are full of these obscure words that had baffled translators for centuries. Kilby was the guy who rolled up his sleeves and dug into those rare roots. And unlike Holland's loud fervor, Kilby was famous for his profound, quiet humility. There's this brilliant historical anecdote about Kilby's humility and intellect, and it all comes down to the number 6. So the story goes that Kilby was sitting quietly in a church one day, listening to a young, eager preacher confidently criticize the King James Bible's translation of a specific word. Kilby didn't interrupt, he didn't make a scene, but after the service, he quietly pulled the young man aside and explained that the translation committee had actually considered the exact alternative the preacher suggested, but they rejected it. Why? Because they had cross-referenced it against ancient manuscripts and found 6 completely different reasons why the young man's suggestion was historically inaccurate. I mean, that is the quiet confidence of a true master.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Titan of Languages, Miles Smith.
Every elite squad has that one person whose skills are just almost unbelievable. For this group, that was Miles Smith. Smith was a graduate of Corpus Christi, eventually the Bishop of Gloucester, and his peers literally called him a walking encyclopedia. He had read all the Greek and Latin fathers in their original tongues. Smith's intellectual devotion was so highly regarded that he, along with Thomas Bilson, was chosen to write the famous Preface to the Reader that appeared at the very beginning of the 1611 Bible. In that text, he vigorously defended the theological and historical need for the Word of God to be fully accessible in the common tongue of the people.
But let's talk about his real superpower, his staggering polyglot mastery of Oriental languages. Smith wasn't just good at Hebrew. He was completely proficient in Hebrew, Chaldee, Syriac, and Arabic. When the team hit a linguistic wall, Smith was the battering ram who could cross-reference a difficult word across 4 different ancient language families just to find its true meaning.
So the crucial point is really captured in how his contemporaries described him. They said Miles Smith had Hebrew at his fingers' ends. What that actually meant back in the 17th century was that he could recall the root of almost any word in the entire Old Testament instantly, straight from memory, without ever needing to consult a dictionary. He was quite literally a human search engine for ancient languages.
And finally, Section 5, the Root Specialist Legacy.
When you assemble an anchor, a visionary, a poet, a grammarian, and a polyglot titan, what's the ultimate result? Well, their shared obsession with ancient evidence ensured that the translation of the prophets wasn't just beautifully written, but structurally flawless. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how all those puzzle pieces fit together. Each translator brought a totally unique academic pillar, a specific devotional focus, and a highly specialized linguistic edge. You had Harding's tenses, Reynolds' root tracing, Holland's poetics, Kilby's rare root analysis, and Smith's absolute polyglot mastery. Together, they covered literally every conceivable angle of the text.
But if we really have to highlight the absolute core of why this specific team succeeded with such incredibly difficult material, it comes down to John Reynolds and Miles Smith. They were the true root specialists of their era. They didn't settle for surface translations, not for a second. They dug deep into the bedrock of the language, grounding the sweeping, mystical, and prophetic poetry in the absolute oldest, hardest linguistic evidence available to mankind at that time.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to ponder. These scholars dedicated their lives, and in John Reynolds' case, his final dying breaths, to perfectly understanding the ancient roots of the words they were translating. So I ask you, if they were the master root specialists of their era, how well do we understand the roots of the words we use every single day? It's definitely something to think about the next time you speak. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking those great questions, and I'll see you next time.